Hey, what do you call a dog with no legs? Or you can call him whatever he wants, but he's not going to come. Welcome back to the 10-Minute Bitcoin Show. Going to get you guys out of here before the next block. We need to talk about some history, guys. I think we need a history lesson around here. We're too caught up in the now. We need to go back to the then. I saw this Pete from Tweeter Pod this morning. It says this attitude is very wrong. This is talking about forcing people to show an ID to do a cryptocurrency transaction. This is very wrong, says Tweeter. The EU can do sting operations to enforce this. If they do, it will crush retail acceptance of Bitcoin in the EU and among all companies with EU exposure. Cypherpunk's right code is an idiotic ideology. Politics is why PGP is legal. I don't agree with all of this, Tweeter. I don't agree with all of this. Let's talk about it though. All right, so I do think that there is certainly an element of the state being able to repress the growth of a thing, right? So I would say that Bitcoin is at this point in time where it's crossing the Rubicon and it's entered into mainstream acceptance, and it's growing institutionally in terms of its adoption, right? We're seeing it go mainstream, so to speak. And a rogue state, a hostile state, absolutely, particularly if it's one of the major, like a G7 nation or whatever, could definitely significantly hurt like the adoption and acceleration of technology like Bitcoin in terms of its acceptance. And what that would do, in the short term and the medium term, absolutely, is hurt its market price. Like, we would not want, at least I'm technically of the opinion, we would not want like the United States government to say that Bitcoin was illegal tomorrow, or create a bunch of lawfare stipulations around how you're allowed to use it or whatever. However, I don't necessarily agree with Peter's characterization here that Cypherpunk's right code is an idiotic ideology and that politics is why PGP is legal. I would say that it's a bit of both, right? I would say that the truth is somewhere in the middle there. On one hand, the reason that we can use cryptography as liberally online as we do today is because we won battles in the courts. However, I would suggest that the reason we won those battles in the courts is because Cypherpunk's right code. Many of you may not know who Phil Zimmermann was, but he's the guy that originally wrote and released the source code for PGP, which PGP stands for Pretty Good Privacy. And it was basically a hybrid encryption protocol that would let you take a blob of data. Like, let's say you wanted to send a secret message to your friend. You could take that blob of data, you would encrypt that blob of data, and then you would encrypt the key that you used to encrypt that blob of data with your asymmetric public-private key, and then, with whoever you wanted to send it to as public key, right? And then you'd send them the encrypted blob, the ciphertext, and then once they got it, they could take their private key and they could use it to decrypt the session key, and then use the session key to decrypt the message, and boom, now you have secure encrypted communication between two parties, which wasn't illegal at the time. It wasn't illegal to actually do this. What was illegal was to export code that made use of like applied cryptography. So what Phil Zimmermann did in 1991 that was illegal was he published source code for PGP that made it basically accessible for anyone to download and access, because you can't really restrict who's accessing information on the internet, where they're accessing it from, right? So it wasn't illegal for Phil to write that code, and it wasn't illegal for Phil to use that code. It was illegal for Phil to publish the source code on the internet. And in a lot of ways, that was a violation of the Munitions Export Control Act. Actually, there's some interesting history here. If you want to go read a deeper dive on the history of what was illegal and how it was classified, I'll post the Wikipedia article here, but our friends at Blockstream actually have a recreation of this RSA encryption in Perl on their website. We're not affiliated. This show is not sponsored by Blockstream. However, I think it might have been Adam Back. At least they claim on here that Adam Back originally released this RSA shirt in 1995 So we need to contextualize this here. Zimmerman releases PGP on Usenet in 1991. And then I think it was 3 years later, I want to say, he started being prosecuted by the federal government for being in violation of this Munitions Export Control Act. And then I think 3 years after that, I think it was by 1996, the federal government dropped the charges that they were pursuing against Zimmerman for releasing this source code. Really because at the time there was just this growing sense of disdain towards the federal government for essentially making it illegal to publish software on the internet that was really good at guessing, not really good, but that was capable of guessing really, really large numbers or really, really large primes or whatever. It's certainly absurd when we think about it today, because we almost take it for granted the amount that encryption plays into our everyday lives. And, at the time, especially in the early 90s, there was this really big push from the government to basically have government backdoored encryption in everything. Like it was, yeah, no, encryption's good, encryption's fine, everybody should have encryption, we can all have encryption, but the government needs to have a backdoor into all of it. In many respects, we're seeing this play out again today. But it wasn't until, I believe it was 1999, there was a student at UC Berkeley who won a civil case against the United States government. His name was Bernstein. And it was basically because he had written an encryption protocol and wanted to be able to publish it online. And he won this civil case against the United States government and essentially had them reclassify these encryption software protocols to be allowed to be published on the internet. And I think, we would never be where we are today. We would probably never have Bitcoin if all of this hadn't have happened. And I think it started with Zimmerman, right? I think it would be a mistake to say it was to just look at Bernstein in a vacuum and say that he won his civil case against the United States government, and that's why we can use PGP now, is because he won that case. And of course, think technologies like Bitcoin rely on encryption, and pretty much everything you do on the internet relies on encryption. You wouldn't be able to do all of the things that you enjoy doing online without the availability of encryption. Asymmetric and symmetric encryption online used pretty much for everything, guys. Without this, we wouldn't have the technology that we have today. We wouldn't have access to the same tools. But I think it's a mistake to say that it was purely political or that it was purely the courts that enabled that victory. I think it was a hybrid. It started with, guys like Phil writing code and publishing that code, even though that was an act of civil disobedience at the time. And he really did that to his detriment, right? But for everyone else, he just went ahead and released the code publicly on Usenet to just demonstrate that it was very difficult, for the U.S. government to restrict that kind of exportation. You can't control information. At least you can't do a very good job of controlling information. And we're just talking about software, that was guessing big numbers at the end of the day. And you can't keep that genie in the bottle. But ultimately, we won legal precedents in the courts, but I would like to think that Zimmerman played a very important role in getting us there, right? Those are the baby steps, getting us to the point where we could win a court case like that with Bernstein versus the United States government, giving everybody the access to those tools and allowing, cryptographers and applied cryptographers to publish their work online. Because if you think about it, what good is open source software if you can't publish it online? Our whole ecosystem today relies on being able to publish your work online and collaborate with people around the world on open source software projects. And it's why we have good, reliable, secure open source software like Bitcoin, right? Like PGP, like Linux, all these things that make the world go round. If you couldn't publish this stuff online, right? We wouldn't have the ecosystem that we have today. So a bit of history there. I hope you guys found that interesting. Tomorrow, I think we're going to talk about Bitkey. I've been wanting to talk about Bitkey. I think that should be good. I like Bitkey. I like what they're doing, but I've got some concerns. All right. 5 seconds. Bye.